Okay, greetings. I'm here today with Nicholas Schmidle, who's just returned from Pakistan after technical deportation from the country, one of the first American journalists to be deported in quite a long time. Nick, it's good to have you back in the United States, but obviously this was a tough issue. What are your first thoughts coming back?
First thoughts coming back was that it was harder buying a cell phone than I ever expected with this inundation of consumer culture. But other than that, it's nice to be back. But obviously, I'm very disappointed at being asked to leave on last Tuesday.
Can you tell us a little bit? You and your wife just came back, and I know that she was planning a big life there. She was a week away from her test in Arabic, had a new job lined up, was working on her master's degree. Can you tell us, just set the context a little bit for what happened and how it happened, and for the readers who are listeners who don't know, Nick just had a major piece in the New York Times Magazine a week ago Sunday called Next Gen Taliban, and apparently more than a few eyebrows went up regarding that article in the Pakistani government.
Exactly. My wife and I moved to Pakistan in February. I moved there in February of 2006. She moved there the first week of April 2006. And I was on a 2-year writing fellowship from the Institute of Current World Affairs, which funds people on these sort of open-ended, freewheeling writing fellowships. I was loosely affiliated with an organization there in Islamabad who hosted me, and for 2 years I was able to travel around extensively throughout the country and report on just about anything I wanted. I mean, everything from rock stars who had cashed in their cultural clout to take on the religious establishment to, over the past several months, kind of this next generation of Taliban along the border areas. I then traveled, in writing the story, I spent September, October, November traveling into some fairly hairy areas, and whether the content of the story is what ticked them off, or whether it was the areas that I went to report the story is what angered them, it's unclear. But the story came out on January 6th, and on January 7th, an ISI agent paid a visit to my house and told
on a bicycle, I guess you said.
And told the guard, the ISI is Pakistan's sort of feared intelligence agency.
But he stopped by on a bicycle?
He stopped by on a motorbike.
Oh, on a motorbike, okay.
And he stopped by and he told the guard that our visas had been canceled and that we were living in Pakistan illegally. And that I had been writing against Pakistan. So we brushed it aside, made some phone calls just to kind of register the complaint that this was happening, but brushed it aside and thought it was typical just intimidation tactics by the intelligence agencies. Then on Tuesday, we showed up, had come back from being out for the day, and our guard told us once again that this time the police had stopped by, and they were coming back in an hour. So about an hour later, the police did stop by, 4 police officers, and they served me a deportation notice saying they had orders to take me to the airport immediately.
And we'll put that a copy of that deportation order on the Blogging Heads website as well. It's fairly interesting if you've never seen one. It's almost pleasant, at least in the communications of one part of the government to another.
Yeah, definitely. So then
you were in one of the rough areas you were in was Quetta, as I understand it. And I've talked to a number of people, Peter Bergen, Nir Rosen, another journalist. Both of those people are affiliated with the New America Foundation. Peter Bergen, of course, is CNN's terrorism analyst. Nir Rosen has written pieces for the New York Times Magazine as well, and Carlotta Gall and Eliza Griswold, another fellow at the New America Foundation, have all been harassed or had some difficulties in Pakistan as well. I learned after your incident. Also, many of them had gone to Quetta. So what is it with Quetta?
It's a good question. I mean, Quetta is the capital of Balochistan, which is the province in southwestern Pakistan that covers almost half the country. And the areas outside of Quetta are off limits to journalists, but Quetta itself has not been. Now, up until about a year ago, the Taliban operated very openly and very freely in the streets of Quetta. And it was very easy to arrange interviews with key Taliban leaders. Since that time, most of the open activity of the Taliban has moved out of Quetta, is more now in the Northwest Frontier province. But we were still able, I met with the very senior and influential pro-Taliban cleric who had been a member of the National Assembly from 2002 to 2007, and he's very much sort of a spiritual advisor, ideologue for the Taliban. And so I spent some time with him.
So he is a member of the Taliban?
Pardon?
So he is a member of the Taliban.
Well, he's about, I don't know, he's probably in his early 70s. I mean, he's missing most of his teeth. So he's not necessarily one of the fighters, but he certainly is one of the ideologues. And spent a lot of time, before the Taliban government fell in 2001, spent a lot of time traveling between Quetta and Kandahar, which is, I guess, around a 3-hour drive. So logistically, it's also a very short trip from what was the center of the old Taliban in Kandahar.
I mean, let me just ask you just maybe what sounds like a naive question, but I'm sure many people will be interested to know. You know, when I see you're this blonde-haired, young-looking American guy. You're not going to be mistaken for some, Arab youth or something. I mean, the difference between you and others would be there, and I think perhaps because of propaganda, perhaps because we have biases built into sort of how we think about extreme Islamists, is that spending time talking to obviously American or Western journalists is not something that they make a daily avocation. I mean, how did you do this?
Well, the Pakistani Taliban are considerably less media savvy than the Afghan Taliban were from 96 to 2001, but nonetheless, there are still some who realize the power of the media and are looking to get their message out. And when I present myself as a writer, someone who's working on a story for the New York Times Magazine, they see this as an opportunity for them to get their message out, which is why, in this story, I spend the day with these Taliban in the Swat Valley up in the Northwest Frontier Province. And on this afternoon that I was there, they administered public lashings to 3 convicted criminals. And there was a big debate amongst the top mullahs in this mosque about an hour before the lashings actually happened as to whether they would allow people to take pictures. But nonetheless, in the end, they decided they wouldn't allow people to take pictures, and the crowd of 15,000 people responded very kindly. When the Taliban are whipping people on the stage and walking around with big guns and rocket launchers and say, okay, we better not see anyone using their camera phone to try and take pictures, you can better believe that no one is going to take their camera phone out.
But they still allowed you to observe.
But they still allowed me to observe, exactly.
And that was part of these pieces you've been writing.
And I'll tell you actually one of the funniest stories from that day. I was standing there right beside the stage, and they had, the Taliban that day had essentially assigned one of the senior lieutenants to protect me and my local guide. And just to kind of hang out with us and make sure that no one gave us a hard time, and that to make sure that everyone knew that we were there as journalists and we weren't doing anything nefarious. And I was standing there taking notes, and this one Taliban fighter comes up and looks over my shoulder and watches me writing in English in a notepad and asks me which paper I work for. And I said that I was a freelancer, but that I was writing something currently for the New York Times Magazine. And he then is speaking perfect English, and I asked him where he learned to speak such perfect English. He said, well, I just actually was living in Texas and Louisiana for the past 10 years. I was running barbecue joints, and I just came back after a few years.
Why, did you ask him where he liked it better?
Well, he said that and I asked him how do you go from serving barbecue sandwiches in Baton Rouge to holding a Kalashnikov in the Swat Valley, and he just said that I'm from the Swat Valley. I had gone there for economic reasons, but this was always in my heart, and a few years ago when this movement started up, I decided to come back.
Oh, that's fascinating. We just had a forum at the New American Foundation called Pakistan in Peril, and we had you speak, as well as Steve Cole and Peter Bergen and Flint Leverett, on some of the issues related to the elections, obviously to the Bhutto assassination, but maybe you might reflect a little bit on how you see the Bhutto assassination, which you wrote about in your New York Times piece, but also, how do you see things tilting forward? I mean, to many of us, we don't have the ability to sort of look at the building blocks of what matters and what doesn't in the Pakistan context. Well, what do you worry about, and what should we not worry about?
Well, we should not worry about the fact that the religious parties, which have been the sort of boogeyman for the past 5 years, this notion that the religious parties are close to taking over the government and implementing this Islamic revolution through the parliament is a total misnomer. The religious parties have never been more unpopular. Now, part of the reason why they are unpopular is because the local people in the Northwest Frontier Province have realized that the religious parties are not the ones who can deliver on their promises to implement Sharia and on their pro-Taliban agenda. They simply, over the past 5 years, failed to do that in the parliament. So what you find is that the sort of common voter in the Northwest Frontier Province is not ready to vote for the religious parties. Some of them have either turned towards realizing that the Taliban and the militant groups are the only ones who can achieve these goals, or they've turned and they're now looking to support the nationalist parties. So in the next coming election, the nationalist parties will certainly be the ones that triumph in the Northwest Frontier province. Now, the second bit about where do I see this going, the day before we left, I guess it was Thursday of last week, was perhaps it was a frightening indication of where this could be going, because for the first time, a suicide bomber struck in Lahore. And Lahore is in the Punjab, which is which is Pakistan's most populous and wealthiest province. And up until now, most of the bombings had happened in Balochistan and in the Northwest Frontier province. So this is slowly extending east. Now, the fact that this bombing happened in the heart of Lahore, which is the cultural heart of Pakistan, the sort of the moderate heart of Pakistan, if you will, was pretty frightening. And then as we were actually getting onto the airplane on Friday, coming back, we met someone else from Islamabad who said that he had heard that there was now wall chalking all over Islamabad saying, the Taliban, we are the Taliban are here, beware. So the fact, that the Taliban are now in the major cities. So this is a frightening development, because it really indicates that the Taliban, while they don't enjoy the sort of grassroots support in Islamabad that they might enjoy in the federally administered tribal areas or parts of the Northwest Frontier province, they have the ability to disrupt public life and to be able to set off bombs and all that.
Does the Pakistan government have the ability to disrupt the Taliban operation? I mean, one wonders. It looks like one side disrupting the other, but not as much disruption going on the other way. What's your sense of it in the tribal areas? Are they worried about the Pakistan military, coming in and shutting down the Taliban?
Well, the Pakistani military. This is something that wasn't mentioned at all in the panel today, but to give the Pakistani military for a moment the benefit of the doubt, about 2 or 3 weeks after I witnessed this public punishment scene in the Swat Valley, the government realized that they were just being shamed. I mean, and it was a pure indication, this public lashings, and in the weeks that followed, the Taliban in the Swat Valley also began to take over police stations, and as they did this, they were lowering the Pakistani national flags and raising their own flags. It was just such a blatant provocation of the writ of the state that the government or the army finally moved in I guess the middle of November, and since then have enjoyed some success at driving the Taliban out of the valleys, out of the semi-urban centers, and not defeated the Taliban, but certainly pushed them up into the hills or pushed them out of the stronghold that was the Swat Valley. Some think that they've actually just simply spread and scattered the Taliban in different areas where they were previously concentrated. But nonetheless, the army had no choice other than to move. I mean, they had essentially, in Swat, set up a mini-state. And this day of this public punishment was the strongest and most clear evidence of that.
One of the things that came up in our discussion today that was I think, frankly, a little surprising for me, and Peter Bergen has written this, was Peter Bergen's comments about what actually caused Benazir Bhutto's death. Now, when Benazir Bhutto was killed, most people were told that there was a gunman and that the gunman shot Benazir Bhutto, and then there was an explosion. And shortly thereafter, we had some doctors come out and say, no, there were no signs of bullets in her skull and no exit wounds, no entry wounds, and that she had hit her head on a sunroof dial or something. Then we got a lot of skirmish around that, and then the view that the government had been intimidating the doctors, and the doctors said, yes, we've been intimidated, and now Peter Bergen has written this very, very interesting piece saying, well, all we have, short of an autopsy, is the original documentation, the original early-on documentation related to her death and what caused it, and the medical examiner's report. But if you go back, there's just no evidence, and so Peter Bergen is basically saying that he believes strongly, and I think you concur, that she was not shot, did not die from bullet wounds, that she died from hitting the sunroof because of the blast, or she was trying to get away from the blast, or perhaps an assassin. And I'm wondering, one, it's fascinating that we're having this debate, and what are the implications of the answer to that question?
This is one of those questions that I mean, this is has sort of Kennedy assassination ramifications, right, where it's something that'll be debated for years. I don't know. I'm also still. I'm not totally sold. I agree with. I mean, I thought that Peter made a good point. I'm not totally sold on the fact that that there was no gunshot. The medical records, as we were saying today, I mean, that hospital was such a madhouse afterwards that I don't really want to conclude as to what exactly killed her. The ramifications, though, of whether it was the blast or whether it was the gunman, I also think are mildly irrelevant at this point. Unless the British...
I think it is relevant in the sense that, as Bergen does say also, regardless whether he's right or wrong in his interpretation of what happened, that the government has so little credibility.
Exactly.
So fundamentally low credibility in the eyes of the public that no matter how this came out, and as you said, they were working very hard to blame someone, you can pronounce his name better than I can,
right,
so early on, and then found that the call came from an area and from a cell phone where there was no cell phone coverage.
Right.
Maybe you might share that. That was a very unique point.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that certainly is the fundamental point, is that no matter what the government says right now about the assassination, the People's Party will not accept it. And even though the investigation team from Scotland Yard has arrived and is involved in the investigation, the People's Party also is not saying they're saying they're also not going to accept that because they think that Musharraf is leaning, or that Musharraf's people are leaning on the Scotland Yard team. They say they'll settle for nothing less than a UN investigation. I mean, this is the fundamental problem, and the fundamental problem is that Musharraf's credibility Musharraf's presence at this point is a divisive factor in the political culture of the country, and so his mere presence is dividing the country, and there can be no proper political reconciliation with him still there.
So as you game this out, and Steve Cole also said today that he sees President Musharraf's influence as a political force waning. You've got the PPP, obviously, with some sort of steward government. Maybe I'm characterizing this inaccurately or wrongly, but I wouldn't say you've got the strongest political force within the PPP up for election. You've got Nawaz Sharif there, but how would you game out some of the political personalities that might end up as prime minister and to some degree at the political helm of the country? And where's the army in this? Does the army at some point discard itself from and distance itself from Musharraf, who's no longer ostensibly the head of the military, or is he the real head of the military behind the scenes, since he helped elevate those people who are head of ISI and who are the Army Chief of Staff now? Do you have any thoughts on those issues?
Well, in terms of, I'll talk about the army in a second, but in terms of the prime ministership, you're right. There are no charismatic or there are no strong personalities that are up for the prime ministership at this point. Nawaz Sharif is ineligible to run. His brother Shahbaz Sharif is ineligible to run. Bhutto is dead. The person who has been nominated to head the party in the parliament, should the PPP get a majority, this Makhtoum Amin Fahim, has the personality of a desk. I mean, it's just there's nothing there. There's no magnetism there. Curiously, the person who is perhaps the most compelling personality to become the prime minister at this point may be someone like Maulana Fazl Rahman, who I profile in the story as being as illustrating this point that the sort of old guard Taliban has lost control over the next generation of Taliban. Maulana Fazl Rahman heads the JUI party, Jamiat Ulama Islam.
And he's younger generation.
He's older. He considers himself, or people consider him kind of the godfather of Mullah Omar's Taliban.
I see.
He had referred to them constantly as sort of as my boys. Maintained very much an image of patron of being sort of the patron of the Taliban. When the Taliban came to power in the mid-90s during Benazir Bhutto's government, Maulana Fazl Rahman was chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee or something, a position that, according to people like Ahmed Rashid, he used to channel funds and to channel influence and to make sure that he lobbied hard for the Taliban's cause. Both in Islamabad.
He could emerge as a
he right now
at the helm?
Potentially. I mean, the army knows that he's pliable. He has some, even though it's dwindling on a daily basis, and this is the scariest thing, is that people like him are losing their control and their influence over the militants, but he still has some semblance of influence in the Northwest Frontier Province and in Baluchistan. And so the army sees him as being someone that's pliable, but also someone that could be kind of a go-to man to negotiate between them. So it continues to. It would not surprise me if Maulana Fazl Rahman emerged as a serious power broker in the post-election scenario.
It's very, very hard for me to see how the neighbors around Pakistan, even with the way in which you qualified his role, would be able to create a narrative that said we're standing by as one of the patrons of the Taliban just became one of the leading helmsmen of the Pakistani government.
You're right, but here's the thing: is that Maulana Fazl Rahman's story in the past few months has been remarkable. He's been a politician. He's been leading one of the country's leading fundamentalist parties. He's been the chief of this party since 1980, and in those 28 years has never met an American official until he met the American ambassador in, I guess, late September or early October. All of a sudden, this year. So suddenly, the Americans realized that he also, this is also someone they should get to meet. People in Bashar's camp told me that they realized they need a bearded turban guy running the show in the Northwest Frontier Province, and Maulana Fazl Rahman could be it. Senior foreign Western diplomats in Islamabad also said, look, he is probably the most pragmatic and wily politician in the country, probably the best politician in the country. But this diplomat added that it would not send a good sign for the direction that Pakistan is headed for someone like Maulana Fazl Rahman to be a prime minister. So it's just, there are just the political options right now are really, really fairly dismal.
So you've just written, several pieces for Slate. Of course, you have your New York Times Magazine piece up there. Have you thought a little bit about, what your next target is now that you're back in Washington?
I would like to write a book. I've been thinking about it for a bit, and I think that I finally have a good conclusion. So I'd like to
airport.
Exactly. I was fishing as to how I was going to conclude the book, whether I was going to do some post-election analysis, after the elections in February. But the deportation, I think, sums it up well, and so I will hopefully get to working on that in the coming months.
Share with our audience your experiences trying to get back into the United States with your wife.
Well, we came through immigration, and as we passed them our letter of what we were declaring or not declaring, they put a big C with a green pen on the note. And Ricky, my wife, said, "This is not good. I don't know what that C means, but no one else has a C on their forms." So sure enough, as we pushed our 10 bags through the customs line, thinking that we were just going to sail right through, they put us off, and they said that it was just a random selection, but they still put us off with a crowd of single-profiled single men, and then proceeded to ask me after they asked me what I did and whatnot, then they proceeded to ask me if I could write down on a piece of paper for them every terrorist that I'd met in the past 2 years while living in Pakistan. And when I told her that actually I had just kind of been thrown out of the country for this very reason, she said just make a list, see if you can make a list of a few people. So we wrote down a few names. She went to her office and came back and eventually let us go. But we spent about 45 minutes there.
Wow. So do you have any other thoughts on things that we ought to, as we look at Pakistan and its political situation in the aftermath of an assassination before a February 18th election, other factors that you think we ought to focus on?
There are a couple of developments. One of which is that in terms of thinking about America putting together a democracy strategy, it has to be kept in mind that this notion of this is the mainstream Islamist parties are suddenly they have to be engaged. They were not engaged over the past 5 years, and many of these politicians from these parties say, look, we were powerless. We were not able to fulfill our agenda, and therefore, because we weren't able to implement Sharia through political means, it created the social space that allowed the Taliban to move in and push for this movement to implement Sharia through militant means. So these religious parties really need to be engaged at every level. And second of all, like I said, following the Bhutto assassination, nationalist sentiments in every province now, with the exception of Punjab, are very, very strong. And the nationalist parties, the PPP's, its support and its rhetoric, and those who were committing all of this violence and the rioting in the days after Bhutto's death were using slogans like, we're done, in the Sindhi language, we're done with Pakistan, and really ramping up the Sindhi nationalist sentiments, which are already very strong in Baluchistan and which are increasingly strong as well in the Northwest Frontier Province.
Do you think that imposing Sharia is vital, is necessary to get some sort of calibrated deal with these territories?
Well, it's now you wouldn't be doing it for the popular will. Now you would be negotiating with the militants. And this. I mean, obviously, it's always easier to think. It's always easier to make policy in retrospect. But had we been able to work with the Islamist parties a bit more constructively over the past 5 years in the Northwest Frontier Province, when a popular mandate had put them in power, then we might have been able to to almost defang these militants who are saying that we also want Sharia, but are willing, we want to do it by the way of the gun rather than the ballot box.
I see. Well, on that optimistic note, thanks for spending some time with us today, Nick, and best of luck to you. Sorry that you had to come back to Washington and share these stories by way of a deportation order, but I'm sure that you will be out there. I know tons of media are interested in talking to you, not just with the subject of having been on the wrong end of the Pakistan Ministry of Interior, but for your insights and what's going on in these tribal areas of Pakistan. There are very few people that have been able to penetrate and get inside in the way you have. And I know you want to go back someday. I hope you can go back. And I know you've invested heavily in learning the language, customs, culture, and so on. So look forward to more. I don't know if you have any parting thoughts, but...
No, I think that sums it up well.
Great. Well, thanks, Nick.
All right. Thanks, Steve.